Q&A at the end as well. Okay, let's start with the internet. As I'm sure you know, the internet was invented in the 1970s by the American military, Al Gore and Tim Berners-Lee, for the purposes of distributing photos of cats and porn. It has, that is my cat. It has expanded somewhat since then. And last year was a landmark year where, for the first time, the majority of human beings on the planet were online. So here in the West, we kind of take that for granted, where most of us have been online for a long time. 2018 was the point where back then, 55% of everyone had internet access. That percentage is still going up. The internet it's fair to say it's not a fad, and it is now a bit more than just cats. Right, so this talk, I will start with an introduction and a little bit about myself and why I should be giving this talk. Then we're going to look at how is artificial intelligence used in advertising, how is it sometimes abused, why digital advertising needs AI, and then briefly going to look into some of how it works. Can I get a quick show of hands for how many people in the audience have a technical background in computer programming or mathematics? Oh, wonderful. Okay. In which case, I apologize, it's going to be quite a quick light section, but I'm happy to go into more details on anything I touch on. And then look at some of the, look at the importance of ethics and some of the positive activity in this space. So we'll start with the gloomy stuff and finish with the positive stuff. Okay, introduction. So hello, I am Daniel Winterstein. As Fazil said, my background is mathematics and AI. I moved to Edinburgh 20 years ago. I love this city. And 2 years ago, founded Goodloop with Amy Williams. This came out of, we've been working in advertising technology and seeing the potential, but also getting very frustrated with some of the practices and thinking there has to be a better way of doing this. And what we came up with is Goodloop. What we do at Goodloop is we give advertiser money to charities. Take money from advertisers and we give it to charities. This is lovely. And the really lovely thing about it is that when I tell people this, they mistakenly think that I'm a nice person. Which the way we do it actually works out that we're not nice people at all. We make a profit out of this. It's a virtuous circle that works for the advertiser, for the company, for the user, for the publisher. Our core insight was people are quite annoyed when adverts, especially video adverts, pop up when they're browsing the web and reading things. And that doesn't work if you're an advertiser, because you're trying to win people over, and frustrating them and annoying them is a bad way to start that kind of client-customer brand relationship. So wouldn't it be better if people were actually happy and in a good mood? And so what we do is we buy advertising space, we replace it with something that says, you don't have to watch an advert, but if you choose to watch an advert, then half the money is going to go to a charity, which you're going to pick from this list of charities. And unsurprisingly, this makes people feel a lot better about watching that advert, which means it works better for the advertiser, it works better for the charity. Oh, here we have some of our 2018 results. So we've been going 2 years. 2018, we raised over 200,000 for various causes. Centrepoint helping the homeless, Save the Children, that was fantastic. They were doing things like, so they do work in the UK. So our adverts funded food for a year for 80 families living below the poverty line here in the UK. We also funded some clinics out in Africa. There's a whole list of stuff. This is a lovely business model, and we'll look at some other business models later on when I get to the positive traction that around other companies which are coming up with ways to do business that actually works for society and everyone as well as the company. Right, enough about me. Let's get on to AI. How do we use AI in advertising? There's a few ways. So the one you're probably very familiar with from the news stories is looking at who people are. Someone has turned up at a website. Who is this person? A big question is, are they a person? And I'll be touching later on ad fraud and just how big a thing robot visitors to websites are. Indeed, if you have a website, most of your readers are probably robots. Another question is this advert appropriate? Suppose you are advertising drink or financial products, gambling. You might be concerned about showing it to the wrong audience. You will also be concerned about your advert appearing in the wrong place. And we'll see a couple of examples later. There's ones like people having adverts for surfing, which were latched onto keywords of waves showing up alongside horror stories about tsunamis. So you want to use AI to have a bit of a smarter understanding of where your ad is showing. Big thing is, does this advert work? There is an old saying that 90% of advertising is wasted. We just don't know which 90%. And one of the goals, one of the kind of promises that digital advertising has held out is that we could work out which adverts worked and which adverts didn't work. And that's one of the drivers behind AI in advertising. It's also one of the drivers behind some of the surveillance and privacy invasion that you may be aware of, is advertisers trying to work out just, did my advert work or not? And then very closely related is optimizing your advert. You quite naturally want your money to drive as much sales for you as you can whilst putting as little as possible into Facebook or Google's pocket. Right, let's go on to some of the bad press that AI in advertising has had, which I probably don't need to say too much about Cambridge Analytica and Facebook and that scandal, because I'm sure you are all familiar with it. Just in case someone has been living in a cave for the last year, Facebook were remarkably careless with the data they held on people, and Cambridge Analytica took that data and used it to do targeted advertising where they were promoting first Brexit and then Donald Trump and other projects. But their goal was manipulating the democratic process through the use of AI and advertising technology. It's about as bad a use of technology as you can come up with. Let's look at some nicer people. This is a screenshot of The Guardian that I took yesterday. So obviously Facebook have a lot of data from you because you gave it to them. What you may not be aware of is just how much tracking goes on as you browse the web. So on a typical web page, most of the data that flows to your browser will actually be, and flows from your browser, will be about advertising. Advertising makes up the bulk of internet bandwidth, not content. And if we look at, this was, so this is The Guardian, they're nice people. This was, and I've switched off my ad blockers, but put in a tool called Ghostery, which tracks who is tracking me. And that has rocked up a score of 105 different companies tracking me looking at that one web page. And some of them you might be ones that you expect. So you can see Google is on that list. There's obviously, in that 105, there will be lots of companies you've never heard of who are nevertheless tracking you. This has, for reasons that I'll look at, become part of how the modern advertising economy runs. And these are, hello.
When you say they're tracking you, are they tracking your IP address, or do they know more information than that?
Really good question. So of that 105, I haven't gone through the list to work out exactly who is doing what. Some of them will, they will all be doing more than IP address. Most of them will be dropping a tracking cookie on me. And then what they do is that will vary. Some of them will try to join up their tracking cookies with the other people's tracking cookies. So for example, if you were to visit one of our if you were to see one of our adverts, we would put a tracking cookie on you, which we'd use for the purposes of seeing, have you seen one of our ads before? Did we show you this ad yesterday? We'll probably show you a different ad today. What we don't do, but what a lot of companies then do, is to try and link up their tracking with other people's to build up a bigger picture of what you've been doing. So some of those companies will know your movements around the internet to quite a fine degree. Depending on the website may have defended you a bit. The website will definitely be telling you what domain, so the domain you're on will definitely be visible. The specific page might not be. I confess I haven't looked inside The Guardian, so I don't know if they're protecting which news stories you're reading. I would hope they are, because they're quite technically savvy and tend to be on the side of the angels. It varies a lot. And a safe assumption would be that if you're not using some anti-tracking software in your browser, then there are quite a few companies who have a detailed record of exactly which web pages you're visiting. Some of them will even go even further and will track your activity on the page. So they'll be looking at, for reasons which might be, often publishers will want to know which bits of their page are working. So they'll put in a tracking software which will track mouse movements and which bits of page are getting seen, which I think is quite an innocent use, but quite detailed data. There are more dodgy uses of, there are companies who, if you start typing something into a form, even if you don't submit that form, some companies will grab the data that you have typed and collect that. So, yeah, if you type something in and then think better of it and decide not to submit it, someone might have taken that already. Short answer, it varies a lot, but assume the worst. I think that's something I want to look at, is there are good players and bad players. And we really want to have some kind of change in the ecosystem that flushes out some of the bad practice. But we also need something which, the good practice has a reason for existing, which we'll get onto, which includes things like stopping organized crime, which again I'll touch on. Really good question. Well, these are, okay, these are possibly one of the creepiest examples of AI and tracking that I am aware of. If you had these, you would not knowingly have Pixel on your phone. It gets bundled inside apps. And this is quite a common thing that, suppose you're making a game app. You're an indie developer, you have some great idea, you just want to make something creative and put it out into the world. But you also have bills to pay, so you would like to get paid. And one of the ways you do that is you put an advertising monetization plugin into your app. And that's going to show some adverts. It's also probably going to collect some data. The data it collects from an app can be very varied. So it could be things like movement data, location data. In the case of this company, if they happen to be part of an app that you install, the app would ask for file permissions, which is a perfectly innocuous and reasonable permission that many apps ask for. It will then use these to try and find photos. What Pixaneye is after is it's looking for photos on your phone. And if it finds photos, it will run them through an image analysis AI, which will try and recognize things like, well, they've got an example here. Try and guess your age, gender, do you have pets? They haven't put this on the slide, but they also do things like your relationship status. They will catch things like changes in status. Have you bought a new car? Did you go on holiday? Have you just broken up with your partner? That kind of really personal data they are going to strip mine from your photos and then transmit back to someone else. Pixaneye's defense is they don't collect the data themselves. They are just making a tool, and it's between the app maker and the app user how that tool is used, nothing to do with them. And they say that this tool should be used for for companies to provide better services to their customers.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Because you're saying what happens, but where is the fundamental contract for these? You,
Yeah.
all of your customers, Pixar, all the rest. Where is that fundamental legal contract that allows you to take any of this data? And I know it's a question that drives at the heart of the whole data collection industry. Where is it? Where is the contract?
In the case of Pixaneye, it will be the end-user license agreement that you enter into when you install the app. The app will say, here are our terms and conditions, here's our privacy policy, and here's the Apple or Android will throw up a slight protection where it says this app wants to access your files. And that is where the legal basis, if it holds, and I'm not sure for these people it does hold. Interestingly, they have they are in the middle of pivoting their business model away from doing this. I think partly because GDPR is throwing up some legal questions as to the legitimacy of this. But that's where the contract would come from.
Not seeing one out of so many, not one case where there is a contract to collect any data at all, unless it's blatantly shown we are going to take your data and profile you and use you. In other words, tell you why they're doing it. And of course, if there is not that offer or even invitation to treat, there isn't a contract, regardless of fancy terms and conditions or privacy statements. So, you know, that's why I'm trying to get a compass point for the rest of the talk. Is any of it?
I'm not a legal expert, so I will not be covering much on the legal side. I can tell you my impressions from working in the industry on where the legals are. But disclaimer, take your own legal advice, please. Certainly in their case, their line is the contract is between you and the app developer, the company who supplied the app, and they would say, we are just we're nothing to do with it at all. We just provided the app developer with a tool for knowing their customer better. And it's sort of, their view is sort of like, we made this sawn-off shotgun, and the person who we sold the sawn-off shotgun to, the nice gentleman in balaclavas, assured us that they were going to use it for hunting rabbits. So that's all good.
We knew nothing about the bank.
Yeah. And we will see that happening. That happens quite a bit in this space. As I say, I think these people are pivoting away from doing this, and I think it's driven by the changes in EU law, making it so that fewer companies are willing to deal with something so explicitly invasive. Right, which brings me on to fig leaves. and the practice of hiding behind a fig leaf. There we have Michelangelo's David, safe for public display. There's a few uses of fig leaves that crop up in AI and advertising. And one of them is that companies saying, we don't actually know who you are. We just have an anonymous cookie on you. You are ID number 3756 through blah, blah, blah. We don't know who that is. It doesn't mean anything. Nothing to worry about. And the weird thing about that is, in many cases, that's actually true. But it gradually stops being true. The more, if all a company knows about you is that you visited a few web pages, they don't really know much. The more tracking they can put together, though, the more that anonymous ID starts turning into something real. It starts turning into a very real portrait of you as a person. And there are a few, many cases, a few famous cases where people have reverse engineered supposedly anonymous data to be able to uncover the persons behind it. One that springs to mind, this is a bit old now. AOL, with good intentions, released a whole bunch of their search engine history for researchers to analyze how people were using the internet. And they had obviously stripped out things like IP addresses and so on, but they hadn't really thought about what was still in the data. And people uncovered the most awful stories in it. Stories like, there was one which the researcher had kindly stripped the names out of the story when they published this, but it was a story of a teenage girl who had had her first love affair and been dumped and was now terribly worried about pregnancy and sexual diseases. And this was all there, written in black and white in the data. So data can reveal more than we, the people holding the data, realize. Another example would be smart meter data has been used to uncover someone having an affair, because it reveals usage of buildings and people being in a building and using it at a time that they weren't meant to be, which then led to questions. And on a more ridiculous note, there's someone suing Uber at the moment for Uber revealing that he had an affair because they accidentally emailed his travel history to his wife. He is legitimately upset with, I'm not sure how to feel on this one. He had an affair. On the other hand, Uber were careless with what was clearly very private data, and I don't think it is for me or for Uber or for any of us to pass a judgment on that private matter. That's a court case, I think, in France that's going on at the moment. We could go through other examples. The AOL data, it contained one of again, this is one there that kindly the researchers stripped out the personal details. A good middle American church-going woman. She participated in bake sales, and she was also into kinky sex. And why shouldn't she be into kinky sex? But that shouldn't be information that's available for people to know. Right, so yes, the idea that an anonymous ID actually means that we don't know who you are, I see that as a fig leaf. It's the legal, you're touching on the legal thing. A lot of companies are operating on the assumption that the old way of operating is still valid post-GDPR, in the hope that the defense is we're not actually collecting personal data, so GDPR doesn't apply to us. It is very debatable whether that should be considered valid at all. So then there's a question of, well, what does your data reveal about you? And you can go to some websites and, well, you can go to anyone now and ask them for a copy of your data. and some of them will be more helpful than others. The first time someone asked Facebook for this, they just shipped a whole load of boxes of raw stuff to him. This is, you look 13 to 54. That is, I went to look at Twitter when I was making these slides. I went to look at what Twitter have on me. So if you go into Twitter, there's a place in your settings where you can see this is what Twitter has as a profile for you. And my profile says I am male, aged 13 to 54. Okay? Yep, they got me. This gives you the impression that Big Brother is not so much watching you as squinting at you very badly and hasn't got a clue. Unfortunately, this is a bit misleading because the real profile that's the profile that Twitter have cared to condense out into human terms. The real profile they have on me is, it is weights in a vector. It is not something expressed in words, and it is not something easily communicated, and they are not going to show it to me. And so I have very little idea what my profile actually says about me. And again, this is another example of a fig leaf, in that Twitter will say, we don't really hold that much data about you. Look, all we knew was my age to within 40 years. So they got, yeah, the right half of a human lifespan. Which, given that I think Twitter's not meant to be used by under 16-year-olds, I don't think you're meant to sign up to an account until you're under 16, is remarkably, they really could have narrowed that down a bit. But the truth profile is something hidden in a more mathematical form. And again, that's partly because that's the way AI is built, and partly because it provides a legal smokescreen to cover just how much is known about you. These piles of laundry are to illustrate the practice of data laundering. Data laundering, this happens elsewhere in AI. Data laundering would be taking data which maybe contains things that we shouldn't know, we can't have, running it through some machine process, and coming out at the other end with a version of that data which has got sufficiently disassociated from its source that we can now play fast and loose with it. I put the names of a few companies up here. A quick show of hands. Who's heard of LiveRamp? Hey, wow, more than I was expecting. Lotame, Blue Kai. Okay, it's safe to say that all those companies have heard of you, and indeed, they have files on you. But again, if you were to ask them, they would say, no, we don't have any files on you. We just provide systems where people can upload data and upload data, sell it to other people, share it around, but it is all anonymized to either a greater or lesser extent. And their position would be, we are not in the business of selling your data. We are just in the business of connecting people who have data with people who want to use it. And again, this is a way in which most of the advertising you see will have some targeting on it. A lot of the targeting comes from companies like this. They get it from shadier companies, well, a variety of sources. Some of them are shadier companies who have got data they really shouldn't be sharing, but have uploaded it into these systems to make money out of it. There's also a lot of data just sloshing around in the kind of grey web, the grey market. So, kittens, they're fluffy. I think I've just done a section on some of the problems of advertising, and probably at this point, well, I'm sure a lot of it was old news, but people are probably thinking, what the hell? Why have we allowed this thing to exist? It's awful. Let's burn it to the ground, burn it with fire. So let me look at the other side of why it exists and why do we put up with adverts? They have a purpose. We like the free internet, and a lot of the free internet is paid for by adverts. I wish there was another way of paying for the free internet. I think the free internet is one of the great, it's a great social good. It means that there is a wealth of data available to huge swathes of people, and a lot of that is funded by advertising. Now, if you could go out and lobby your politicians to find a better way of funding the internet out of public funds, that would be great. In the meantime, I think advertising has a purpose in supplying that funding. If we look at why companies are collecting data on you, then if you imagine the internet from the point of view of an advertiser, one of their worries is that a lot of their money is actually not going to showing ads to people at all. It is going to adverts which never get viewed by a human being. A disturbing number of adverts are just watched by bots. A variety of bots. So there are the perfectly innocent bots like the Google Web Spider and many other spider bots which are going around collecting data on the internet, accidentally triggering adverts as they go. There is also the more pernicious fraud bots, which it's estimated that last year $19 billion was raked in by criminal gangs running ad fraud bots. So these are, the way this works is it's real adverts on real but dodgy websites being watched by robots. And it's huge business. Happens in a variety of ways. There is some of it is done by hacked computers. So you will get, one of the things that gets done with hacked computers is rather than installing viruses in them or malware, sometimes they get turned into advert watching machines, which will, hidden within your browser, they will be surfing the web, visiting the fraudsters' websites. Some of it goes on in spoof websites, which are pretending to be a legitimate website. So a website will claim to be The Economist and show some adverts and get some money. Some of it is spam websites. It adds up to a lot of money. And the people who should be policing this are probably the big ad tech players, which are Google is by far and away the largest. Facebook is the next. Google has proved itself not to be terribly good at policing this. And I have no evidence for saying this. I'm just going to be cynical for a moment and say that for every dollar that goes to the fraudsters, Google is taking about $1 to its own pockets. So they don't really have an incentive to stamp out fraud. And it's certainly noticeable that Google's anti-fraud and anti-false advertising moves have generally lagged behind the industry finding solutions to those things itself. So they tend to patch the problem after other people have already solved it, which does suggest that there's a certain lack of urgency to them, fed by they're getting paid for this. As I say, there's no evidence for that. That is just cynicism. What there's certainly evidence for is that a significant fraction of advertising, probably about 10%, some estimates put it higher, is going into criminal pockets. And so one of the things that is done to defend against that is to put tracking in. So some of the, when we had those 105 trackers on The Guardian, some of them will be there to try and work out was this advert actually viewed? And was it viewed by a human being on a legitimate computer, or was someone spoofing their IP, spoofing their who they are? Basically, was this crime or was this real? So that's what some of those trackers are doing. And this feels like a very valid use of tracking, in that I do not support fraud. I certainly don't support mass fraud on a giant scale that helps undermine the internet. And so having something in place that tackles that feels like something that we need. Of course, we can look at whether surveillance tracking is the solution to that problem. But that is one of the drivers for where the trackers have come from. Another good thing about this stuff is historically advertising was the preserve of the big companies. If you want to run a Super Bowl ad, you know what? The little corner shop around the corner, they're not running a Super Bowl ad. Pizza Hut can run a Super Bowl ad. They can run their ads on your telly. And your local pizza place, run by the local Italian family, they cannot run an advert on the telly. The internet has changed that. The internet has allowed small-scale companies to advertise. And the way that it's done that is that you can reach niche audiences. So niche advertisers can reach niche audiences. And that's a step change in making businesses viable that were not viable before. So there's been, one of the things the internet's done that's very positive is have an explosion of creativity around the types of things people make and sell. And I picked here an example of a company that makes dogs apparel. That's pretty specific. You couldn't take out adverts in a newspaper for that normally, but you can do that online, and you can do that online because you can target it. So that's one of the things that targeted advertising does. It allows niches to connect, and that does enable creativity. Okay, some of the bad, some of the good. Let us have a look at a bit of how the machine functions. Imagine you are reading an article online. Your perspective on this is probably quite a calm, peaceful experience. A lot like reading an article in a physical newspaper. You just happen to be reading it on your phone or your computer. Behind the scenes, there's actually a lot going on. When you visit that web page, the publisher will have installed on the web page an advertising widget. The advertising widget will call back to a software system which represents the publisher. That is going to call some exchanges. If you imagine stock exchanges, where and it will go to those exchanges and it will say, Daniel Winterstein, well, it won't say Daniel Winterstein, it will say ID 37652B is reading this article on, he's reading an article on Brexit in the BBC. Well, not the BBC, they don't show ads, The Guardian say. What am I bid to show an advert here? And then the exchanges will send it out to dozens of companies that represent advertisers. Not directly advertisers, they are aggregators. And those companies will look at the opportunity. They will call their data provider to see what they can know about this website and about this person. Because they've been handed an ID about me. It's kind of meaningless to them, but they'll call a data broker who will try and tell them more about me. And then they will put a bid in for what they're willing to pay to show me an advert. And this will involve, easily over 100 companies, all in a fraction of a second. This auction will take place in about 100 milliseconds. In fact, these days, it currently takes place twice for reasons which are quite boring. They're around some limitations in the dominant Google ad systems. The ad manager for publishers, DoubleClick for publishers, has some limitations which have led to something called header bidding, which is, if you've noticed going to a website to read an article and your phone gets hot in your hand, that will be because your phone is running a version of this mad stock exchange-like auction, which it is then radioing back the results to the server, which is also running another copy of that auction, and then it's picking the best and serving up the highest paying advert to you. So this is what's going on underneath the scenes when you view an advert. This is going on 30 billion times a day. So this is a huge amount of data and activity that's going on online, which creates one of the driving factors around how the technology in ad tech works. It has to be very performant in that your latency times are incredibly short. If you're making ad tech software, it has to be able to make decisions within a fraction of a second. If you've got 100 milliseconds, including round trips to collect data, you really have no time at all to then analyze that. Which then leads to, actually, a lot of the AI that we use in advertising is relatively simple algorithms. So if you're following, yeah. What do we use? We use, it depends on which bit problem we're solving. We use, for extracting data about people, we use some quite sophisticated natural language processing technology. And for making sense of data about people, again, we use quite sophisticated technology. That's happening offline. So that's not happening in the fraction of a second. So you can use sophisticated technology, like the image analysis stuff I was showing earlier, if you do it offline around analyzing someone. And then you've got to condense it down into just a handful of features which are going to be used in that very fast online process. The online processes tend to use collaborative filters and linear regression, linear optimization for the optimization piece. Because throughput and speed are, in that critical path, throughput and speed are king. So I thought I'd talk briefly on what a collaborative filter is. The idea is we want to know, will this advert work for this person? And the way we might do that is to build a big table of what each person thinks of each piece of content that they encounter. Which websites do they visit? Which adverts do they click on? So this is going to be a matrix, a giant matrix, which will produce a vector for each piece of content, each person. And then if you're considering how will I react to this advert that I haven't seen before, you can look at, well, who are some people with similar vectors to me? So they have had similar, their viewing history in the past is similar to mine. How did they react to this advert? If they liked it, I'll probably like it too. There's an obvious problem with this, which is that matrix is, it is vast, it is sparse, and you're going to struggle to get meaningful results out of that. You're also going to struggle computationally to work with something that big. So we've got to compress that matrix. And we're going to compress it in a couple of ways. Rather than talking about individuals as individuals and tracking my watching history per se, we will track my watching history, but then we will map me onto a much simpler model by describing me in terms of a few archetypes. I realized everyone stuck their hands up earlier for knowing machine learning. So instead of archetypes, I should say we will use clustering to reduce the space we're looking at. And there are different clustering algorithms that get used. You could use PCA to squish down the number of dimensions. You might also use something like k-means. And indeed, you probably use both of those combined. At any rate, you're going to end up with a picture of me which says, well, based on his viewing history, which we're going to keep and use, we are going to describe him. Our thumbnail sketch will be, here is a British, Dan seems British, and we have this, our model of British people is British people like tea, therefore we will show him this advert for tea. And on the other hand, we are also reducing the dimensionality on the adverts and compressing them, and using some semantic analysis so that when a new advert shows up, we can have a sense of what it's going to be like based on the keywords that describe it. And this allows us to turn our giant matrix into something that's quite small and computable. Happy to go into that in more depth later. That's actually about as technical as my slides get. So apologies for the technical people in the audience. This is very related to a technique which has taken off in the last few years in advertising called lookalikes, which is where, rather than building a generic archetypes, which we do, we also build an archetype for a particular company about who their customers look like. And then Facebook really led on this. If you're doing Facebook adverts, you can upload your customer data into Facebook, and then you can say to Facebook, I would like to advertise to people who they look like my customers. They are lookalikes to the people who buy from me already. So this is the next evolution of that idea of clustering and using archetypes to describe people, is having these company-specific models of my customers, and then being able to target against that. Very powerful. It has also, as you might infer from that, meant that Facebook is not only collecting the data that you as a user have given Facebook, Facebook is also collecting data which companies you shop from have then uploaded into Facebook. And I've named Facebook here as they were the people who led on the concept of lookalikes. But it is also, this is done by Twitter, it's done by Google, it's done by several other major players. So there's this, you gave your data to one person, they might quite possibly have then shared it around a lot more. This is another reason we use AI. Obviously, this is not an AI example. This is a real-world example of what you really don't want to happen with your advert. So Burger King were probably not best pleased that their 2 for free cross sandwich, look at all those fat and unhealthy food, was shown next to a billboard for 1 in 3 people in Louisiana will die from heart disease. Actually seems like a really good pairing from a public health point of view. And could we mandate that this happens all the time whenever Burger King show an advert? The more general thing is that advertisers are, in the old days, they used to speak to a newspaper and say, and the newspaper would say, your advert is going on this page, it will run next to these stories. Now most of the advertising is being just pumped out into exchanges, and the advertiser doesn't really know where the advert is going to end up. Right. So we use AI to analyze the pages that the adverts are landing in to do things like topic extraction, sentiment extraction, to avoid doing things like putting an advert on a story very few people want to advertise on stories about death and disaster. And there's certain pairings that people definitely want to avoid, like that one. Right, let me loop back to ethics. A common line in AI is, we are just making tools. AI is just a tool. And I think that is true. AI is just a tool. It can be used for good or for evil. But that has to be, too often in ad tech, that is the beginning and the end of the conversation. AI is just a tool, that has to be the start of the conversation. It can't be an excuse for not having the conversation. We have to think about where our tools go, how they are used. And it's possible that even well-intentioned AI, even AI which was made without any malice, can still be misused. So, for example, techniques around optimizing where adverts are going by looking at how people respond and then putting more adverts to where people respond to them. These techniques were invented for the reason of, well, let's show you relevant ads. Rather than showing tampon ads to men, let's try and get that to the people who are actually going to respond to the advert. Perfectly innocent reason for developing it. If you're not careful, though, that same technique will do things like find out that the people who respond to offers for credit cards and loan sharks are the most vulnerable people for whom those offers should not really be shown. And that AI, without any malice, is going to optimize in that direction. So we need to have care with what we're doing, which leads me to the suggestion that I think every company that uses AI should have an ethics process where they take a step back and they consider what they're doing in the same way that anyone doing medical research, and indeed increasingly anyone doing other forms of research, will go through an ethics committee and an ethics process. We should be doing that in industry. And when I say any company that uses AI, I think in a few years' time, I can shorten that to just any company. Right, what if the AI, we often see AI as adversarial, it's against us. We are the target in advertising terminology. What if the AI was not targeting us? What was it if it was a partner that was on our side? And there are some positive moves in this direction around researchers and companies who are developing personal AIs. In ad tech, they're called personal information management systems, which is not very catchy. The idea here is an AI which is going to represent you on the net and have your interests at heart and can engage in conversations like proving that you are a human being and not a bot. So the combating fraud use case, or selecting relevant ads and discarding the irrelevant ones, but whilst not exposing you to the Cambridge Analyticas of this world. And finally, let me finish with some tools you can go out and use which will have a positive effect on your internet experience. If you do not want to be tracked online, then I highly recommend having an ad blocker installed. Ad blockers, because whilst blocking adverts, they also will improve your privacy a good deal. So if that, on the Guardian website where I was getting 105 trackers on me, that was after I switched my ad blocker off. With my ad blocker on, I got 6. Ad blockers don't give you privacy completely, but they give you a lot more privacy than you have without them. If that's not enough for you, then a tool like Ghostery or Privacy Badger will give you quite hardcore privacy online. And I guess the ultimate tool is a system called Tor, which is a web browser which will very much hide who you are. Other positive tools, Ecosia. Ecosia is a search engine which they have the nice business model of a fraction of their profits go to funding planting trees. And if you use them, you will get a report as you use them as to how many trees have been planted whilst you've been using Ecosia. So I think this is similar to the Good Loop model, a really nice way of putting your attention to a good cause. They are also committed to privacy. On the search engine side, DuckDuckGo are very much committed to privacy, also a good search engine. Firefox, if you're looking for a browser which has some privacy built into it, Firefox has more than most. I would probably rank them as Firefox, Safari, and then Chrome, and then the Windows ones last of all, partly because the Windows ones tend to get hacked more. And I've also put Goodloop on this list as people who are doing good in this space. We will not sell your data. We will not do anything dodgy with it. And we are, it's very simple at the moment, but we are building out a tool which will let you see the data that is held on you and take control of it in terms of deleting it and indeed instructing us to go out to other companies and tell them to delete what they're holding on you. Right.
Are there any tools for mobile or?
Oh, yes. So you can get an AdBlock browser. You can't get plugins on your mobile, but you can get AdBlock Plus Do a Browser for the mobile phone. It's a version of WebKit, so it's very similar to Chrome or anything else. You can also get Firefox Quantum. So those are both good browsers for your mobile phone. Right, I should wrap up. Thank you very much for listening. Any questions? Oh.
Yeah, I think there are plenty of questions. I certainly have a few. So the format is if you can introduce yourself and say what you do, so we have a better idea of which type of ad to send you next.
Yeah.
So
we are recording this.
Robin Hill, I'm here in informatics. I was wondering, maybe in connection with your AI thing, how easy is it for me to create something that's more like an avatar to be my lookalike and to sort of sculpt what's put out there, what I've got. So rather than just trying to block it, I'd rather, tweak things maybe a bit or something. Is that possible? Is that something that then fool things or not?
Yes, absolutely. So there's some software made for the purposes of people creating noise and hiding their tracks. I think one of those is called Chaff, and it will create a random trail across the internet. So it's not trying to sculpt so much as
It's masking and
mask. Yeah. There is certainly sculpting software in use by the criminal gangs because the value of an advert varies wildly. So this cuts to the Goodloop model, actually. We buy advertising space at about £1 per 1,000. And then because we're buying stuff that would mostly have been ignored and we get much better engagement, and we then sell it at about 20p per advert. So that's a 200 times uplift in value. If you get into selling things like financial products, or if you get into selling gambling, then gambling ads are worth a lot more. Financial products and gambling ads are worth probably the most. So someone can be paid £20 for a click through to a financial product, or similarly to a gambling site. So the criminal gangs want to get those adverts. They don't want to be getting the 0.1p ad, they want the £20 ad. And the only way they're going to get the £20 ad is if they fool the advertiser into thinking they are that person. So they have software that does exactly that.
It's like pretending I earn $1 million or something like that.
Yep.
Or getting that. But then that would have the knock-on effect to your Goodloop with the higher fees or resulting for that. So.
Yeah, so the criminal people will do things. They will spoof their location so that they're in a wealthy area. They will fake a history of doing things like wealthy people in order they can get the right adverts. Yeah. And if you wanted to write software that does that, you could. There is a slight arms race with companies like Moat who are trying to detect exactly that software.
I'll ask a question while people are preparing. So how do you distinguish between those who would watch an ad without having to pay some of the money to go to charity, and those who would only watch an ad if a percentage of the money goes to charity.
Um,
Do you actually distinguish between them?
no, I guess it's so we will show some of the people who watch our ads would have watched an ad anyway,
Okay.
but we get a much higher percentage. And
So everyone who watches an ad, you assume they want to give some of the money to the charity.
if you watch one of our adverts, so if you start it and you don't kill it, it reaches the 15-second mark, we're going to give some money to charity. We'll ask you which charity from a shortlist to pick. If you don't pick anything from the shortlist, then we'll just split it equally between the three.
So does the company that hires you to open the ads for
Yeah.
them, do they have an incentive to ask you to build a model that psychologically understand who are out of the guys who are going to watch, good people, let's say, who wants to contribute some to charity, or there are some people who doesn't care, they would watch an ad anyways, whether the money goes to charity or not?
Varies a lot on the company. In some cases, the company, they only care about, will this person then visit my website, buy my product? So some of them, we measure the click-through, and we also do brand uplift studies where we use a tracking pixel to then reach people afterwards and give them a survey on what do they think of this brand. Do they recall the ads that they've seen? How do they feel positive or negative about the brand? And so for a lot of our advertisers, the charities are nice to have. What they're paying us for is that we can get an audience who's in a good mood. For some of the brands, they are very into the charity thing. So if I take Tom's Shoes, who advertise with us, their model is when you buy a shoe from them, some of the money from each shoe purchase will go to, they give shoes away to people who need them. So what we're doing with advertising fits very naturally with how they operate anyway as a company. And there's also an added benefit for, so it was sort of straightforward for them to say that's how we want to advertise. It also has an added benefit for them of the kind of people who respond to the good loop, why don't you do this for charity, are also the sort of people who will respond to Tom saying, we're an ethical company who does things for charity. So for them, it's a very nice, virtuous link up. And they've run a series of campaigns with us. And obviously, they also care about, does this sell shoes? And it turns out that, yes, it does sell shoes. But
It hasn't worked on you.
no.
Are there any other questions? Yes.
You talked about using AI to detect, is it a human
Yeah.
that's watching? Can you say like what techniques your AI uses to figure out if it's a human watching?
Okay, we'll look at, our AI is actually fairly, when you're watching an advert, there'll be about 3 or 4 different systems all trying to answer that question. So shall I talk about the most sophisticated one that's likely to be in the loop? They will do things we're not doing, which is they will keep a history of your viewing habits. And that's part of how they're trying to answer, are you human? If your viewing habits are you keep hammering the same IP address, keeps hammering the same websites and the same web pages, probably fake. So they're looking for a varied and realistic pattern of behavior from both from your browser and from that IP address in general. They will model the IP addresses, so they will know that this IP address is for a university and therefore it has different behavior to the IP address for a mobile phone or for a home. Mostly it's done, a lot of it's done by IP address. That's the kind of strongest thing. Some of it's done by tracking cookies. And then another key thing is measuring movement of the web page, which is both detecting are you a human and also detecting the, if you don't check for whether the ad was on screen, then publishers, and by publishers I kind of mean Google, will sell you invisible ads. They will sell you adverts that were never on screen. So one of the things you check is the movement of the web page to find out when your ad came on screen and how long it was on screen. And if it was invisible, you then phone up the person who sold you the advertising space and say, you were selling me dodgy inventory. Does that answer the question? Yeah.
When you are speaking about the movement that you have inside the website,
Yeah.
You collect like the X and Y for its movement. You go with the arrow or the mouse, something.
We don't. We will collect, is our ad unit on screen? So was it off the page or was it on the page? And we'll collect if you do something like a mouse over or a click. There are other people who will collect every mouse movement, every keystroke.
It's coordinate X, Y for its movement.
Yeah. Now there are protections in the way that advertising is served through iframes, which means that an advert itself can't collect too much. An advert can only collect like X, Y, and mouse movements for things within the advert. They're in this. If you're familiar with iframes, then that'll make sense. If you're not, they're in this sort of sealed sandbox where they can't see the rest of the web page. However, the rest of the web page probably also contains a dozen tracking tags and analysis tags, which will be able to see the whole web page and do that kind of analysis.
Sandbox, you mean that it keeps track of my movement inside the website? Like if I go here, keep track of the line.
So if it's if I'm serving the advert, I can't see your movement around the website. I can only see your movement if you move over the advert itself.
By clicking.
By clicking, if you scroll it on screen, I'll see that it was scrolled on screen. But I won't be able to see what you're doing on the rest of the web page. However, there are other tracking tags which will be in that web page which can see that and do see it. So if you don't want that tracked, install something against it. Yeah.
Why
Do you mind introducing yourself?
Oh, sorry. My name's Ben. I work for People's Postcode Lottery. Why have none of the news sites out there, The Guardian being on the side of Angel and so on, sold me on how well they protect me from ads? So, for example, our ads play in iframes. You don't need to know the technical details, but it means that the people running the ads know less about you. Come use our site. Would the advertisers be acting against that? Do you therefore get a lower rate for your adverts, or some other?
Certainly, if you didn't offer tracking, you would get a lower rate for your adverts, because people would then, the advertisers would be afraid that they'd be much more worried about fraud and things. Also, targeted advertising is vastly more profitable than untargeted, so you would lose that. So I think that might be one reason. And I think another reason might be probably most people aren't aware enough of these things to care.
Okay.
I don't know. Good question.
It seems it kind of goes with your business model that, you know, we're being more moral about our advertising. So really we're being more moral about the companies that we partner with. We're putting a little bit of sandbox around it.
But is it not also that although the Guardian might be better, it's still not good? I mean, you still got 105, for example. So it might not be 200, but maybe they just don't want to mention it at all.
There's probably an element of that. I can't speak for them. And there's, I think there's one of the things. So one of the most effective privacy tools have been the ad blockers, and they're mostly being installed not because of the privacy benefit. They're being installed because of they improve your online experience. They will also do things like make your phone battery last longer. So that's been the driver for that. We've done some user testing around Good Loop. And one of the things that people have said to us about data was they like the idea that we're going to be responsible with data, but the thing that really switches them on is the charity donation. So I think it's that even companies like The Guardian are like, we make money out of this and not enough people care for us to stop.
somehow it will be deleted from our files and it will be substituted with something newer, or are they continuously keep on tracking the data and saving them?
Continuously tracked and saved. A lot of the profiling data is out of date and rubbish. So profiling data will have things like your address from 5 years ago, your job from 5 years ago, and it will all be merged together. And so a lot of the data is actually pretty poor quality. Legally, it's now the law that within the EU, data should only be held for as long as is necessary. So companies should now be deleting data as it falls out of date, and they also have a responsibility to try and keep it up to date. But I think in practice, very few companies are doing that.
I have a question. I was just, I got quite confused by how you clustered your customers.
Yeah.
So when you're using your K-means and your PCA, so if you're moving from a feature space to a component space, how do you make inference back about your customers? How do you know which points, let's say in this two-dimensional axis, corresponds back to Alex, who watched your ads several million times?
All right, I have, so I will have taken Alex's history and fitted him to a cluster and said, Alex belongs 75% to this cluster, 25% to that one. And now that is, in the moment when I'm deciding what advert to say of him, I won't consider his history. I will consider just the clusters he belongs to.
Okay.
So say he is a member of the interested in technology cluster. I have an advert for technology. It matches that cluster. And so that's how I'm making the decision.
Is there any point in your two-dimensional clusters graph that corresponds directly to Alex?
I've thrown away, I've thrown away the Alexness.
So
I've collapsed him down.
You could work reverse engineer and figure out which points exactly corresponds to Alex.
Well, what I'm probably doing is keeping the full history on Alex as well. And I have an ID which corresponds to Alex. So the ID records will say this was Alex.
So that point has X variants of Alex, but it's not full Alex.
Yeah, that compressed point doesn't identify Alex at all. And indeed, this kind of suggests one way in which we can be doing more anonymous work, because we don't need to keep those audit trails. We're making the decisions on much more anonymous data than we're actually holding.
Yep.
Mr. Mayur, would you cluster people based on their whether they're more likely to donate to a certain charity or not, and how would you ethically debate that?
So we don't at the moment. Would we? We would. So we would certainly offer it as a. If you encounter one of our adverts, at the end of the advert, it will have a call to action around signing up to our data platform. If you sign up to the data platform will then say, here's the various data we'd like to hold on you, here's what we'd like to do with it. And that, well, it doesn't include that at the moment, but that is something that I would ethically see no problem in saying to someone, can we do this? And if that person understands and agrees, and the incentive for them to agree would be, we can probably pick better adverts for you. If we know that you are into cats, then we will show you more cat-related things. And therefore, more charity will go to cat charities. So our approach as a business is to put those choices to people in that clear fashion of, we'd like to do this. Here's why you might think it's a good thing. Do you think it's a good thing? If you say no, we won't do it. More generally, we get into very interesting spaces around what one does with data.
Sorry about that thing. So,
charities, you put that as well, because more you know about the people, which can be people watching that video. Would you change the charities you're, putting after the ads?
Not at the moment. At the moment, the charities we show people are a short list that's picked by the advertiser. And they generally pick stuff that fits with what they're advertising. So when we're running, Purcell ran adverts about children getting mucky, and they picked charities which are around children doing stuff. Nor, who are Stock Cubes, had charities around food banks and providing food for people. What we have planned is that you can tell us what charity you like, and the charities you like will then be the ones that come back, so that your charity can always be an option, and you can always say, I want to give to whichever charity you want to give to. But we don't do that yet. That's planned. Ask me in a couple of months.
We have time for 2 more questions, so if you can...
I just have a quick one. Do you think it's entirely fair and ethical that you pose the question about tracking people's data in an entirely positive manner in terms of this is what we'll give you? Because it seems a little underhanded. These are people who aren't literate, they don't understand how that works, and yet you phrase it as if it's entirely a good thing when there are actually downsides too.
It's a good question. We are trying to avoid the downsides around, we won't sell data, we also won't put data into the places where there's this grey area where you're not actually selling it, but you've allowed it to be joined with other people. Which is, so a lot of this is people, there's a lot of people who say, oh, we never sell your data. We just swap it with other people. So we're not going to do that. So I hope that we're operating in the space where we are keeping your data private, and therefore a lot of the downsides aren't going to apply. There is still the potential of, we also vet who we work with. So we wouldn't, there's the potential, say, for data about your economic status, which we're not collecting. But if we were to collect that, for it to be used to target you for things like loans that you can't afford. And that can be done without the data being sold or shared, and it would still be immoral. And our defense against that is we have a process around the advertising campaigns that we'll run where we would not run such an advert campaign. It would go through a process that goes, but this product is dangerous if it goes to these people, we must screen against that or not run it. I think it's a good question. It is not automatically ethical what we're doing, and we have to actively be looking at that in order to remain ethical. And I think that goes for a lot of companies that work with data, that it's not enough to just set up a good process. You have to monitor it and care about it. If this has not convinced you, then don't give us data.
Software developers hiring software. When it comes to the, you mentioned before about you can track the mouse on the advert. Presumably, if a website works together with the advert, why they can then track, they can send the data to the advert, to the advertiser, even if you're not hovering over the mouse.
Yep, you're right, and that happens. A lot of the time, websites will install pixels at the top level, which is around tracking how people arrive at the site or getting more money from advertisers. And those pixels can be fairly innocent, or they can do more intrusive things.
I think we have a question for one last one. I think Daniel will hang around later if you have more questions. You'll be over here. So is there a final question? I think somebody in there had a question. No? Okay. I think this is it. So thank you, Daniel, for a very thought-provoking talk.
Oh, thank you, Faisal. Thank you, everyone, for your time.
Thank you for being here, and we'll be back next week with support vector machines. So we'll have a workshop on support vector machines. So if you are interested, you're welcome to come and join us. Thank you.
Next slide.
Next one. Great job. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Hello, yeah, absolutely.
Mic.